Hello to the Central Church of Christ in Augusta. I'm excited to get to spend some time with you virtually, and I'm thankful for all the work that's going on there. Catherine and I still talk about how much we enjoyed the weekend last year we were able to spend with you all and to get to know some of you with the Saturday workshop and worshiping with you on Sunday. And I've enjoyed getting to know Scott and Jeremy and Samuel over our last couple of visits there, and so I know they're doing a great job. You're blessed to have them. And I hope and pray that everything's going as well as possible for you all. I know, like us, you've been dealing with all the challenges of the last few months and navigating all of those. We are here in a little studio we have outside of our church building. This is where we've been recording a lot of the lessons that we've been putting online, and I know that you all have had to do a lot online as well, as we all kind of adjust to what's been happening and what will continue to happen. But I'm thankful that you're letting me be part of your Wednesday night series. But we're doing ours the same way, incidentally, all on video. And so I think it's a neat opportunity that we get to hear from people who are all over the country. And that's one maybe positive aspect that comes from doing it this way. But the request was that I would choose one of my favorite sermons, one of my favorite lessons to share with you. And Catherine always tells me, she kind of gives me a hard time. Usually my favorite lesson, my favorite sermon, is whatever one I've just been working on. It's hard for me to keep track of what an overall favorite would be. But as I was thinking about this series, I thought about a series that we've been doing through the book of Philippians. We just recently finished it, and maybe one of the reasons that a series through Philippians really resonated with us is because shortly after all of the shelter-at-home rules were in place here in Tennessee, it sort of felt fitting that we would spend time thinking about Paul being under house arrest and what he was writing to the church at Philippi. And it was amazing to see how many of the themes throughout the book really resonated with what we were dealing with. It probably shouldn't have surprised me, but it was fascinating to see those connections. And I believe through His Word, God was giving us some solid guidance during those first very difficult weeks and even months. And I know that as we reflect on the book of Philippians, we often think about a key word being rejoice. The words for joy and rejoice show up over and over in Philippians. And what makes that seem strange to us is because Paul is in prison. And he's not in the kind of prisons we'd be used to in America. He's in a different type of prison where you provided your own materials. He's dependent on other people, like the church at Philippi, to give him financial support, to make sure that he could have the kind of food and the sustenance that he needed. But in the middle of all that, his concern wasn't on himself. His concern was on serving God. And so there's this thread that runs all throughout the book where he's calling them to live differently. And we get to Philippians chapter 2, where he gives us that beautiful picture of Jesus coming to the earth, humbling himself, and being made obedient to the cross. And he sets that out as a guide for us. That's the kind of humility we're called to. And then he encourages them in chapter 3 to continue pressing on for that's the goal that we should be working toward. And then he will talk about Euodia and Syntyche and apparent issues of unity in the church in Philippi. And it's at the very end of the book where I'd like for us to focus for just a few minutes together in Philippians chapter 4. A few years ago, as we were preparing to move from Mount Juliet, Tennessee to Russellville, Kentucky, we had been in Mount Juliet for 6 years, had a lot of great friends there, and so it was an emotional time when we left. And I can remember talking with one of our friends at church, a woman who had been such an encourager to us. Catherine and I moved there right out of college. We'd just gotten married, and this was someone who had given us a lot of great advice and guidance. And so as I was talking with her about the move, I mentioned how close Russellville was to Mount Juliet. In fact, since Catherine's parents lived in Lebanon, Tennessee, not far from Mount Juliet, we'd be in that area very frequently. And she stopped me in mid-sentence, and she said, "It's not going to be the same. Don't act like it will be." And I've never forgotten that. Because what she pointed out is a tendency that I have, which is to minimize whatever I'm dealing with as a way to get through it. So to say something has happened in my life or in my family's life, my tendency is to try to say, well, this is not that bad. We'll get over it. We don't need to worry too much about it. And yet there's something important about recognizing what's happened. If there's an issue in my life, I've got to take the time to name what that issue is, to fully consider it, to let the weight of it kind of sit there, and for me to really encounter all the ramifications of what I'm dealing with. And I think when it comes to the last few months, we have to understand it's not quite the same. This is not quite the same as being there in person. You've probably had to do a lot of things that aren't quite the same. And so it's interesting for me that in the midst of all of this, we just stop and realize this is not going to be the same. If it were up to us, we'd be doing things differently. What does God's Word, what does Philippians have to tell us as we deal with the life that's not quite the way we want it to be? Once we're thinking about that, I'd like for us to look at Philippians chapter 4, beginning in verse 7. And the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there is any excellence and if anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things. The things you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at last you have revived your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned before, but you lacked opportunity. Not that I speak from want, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. I know how to get along with humble means, and I also know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. Now it's important for us just to pause right here and to reflect on something powerful that Paul is sharing with us. He's saying that he's learned how to be content. Contentment is challenging for us. We've had the opportunity as a family to play a lot of games lately. Especially when we were at home most all of the time, we played a lot of board games, and one of those was Monopoly. And we didn't just play Monopoly for 30 minutes or an hour and then count up the money and see who was ahead. When we play Monopoly, we play to the bitter end. I mean, we play to where everyone is bankrupt except one person who's won. And one of the things that's interesting when you're sitting around playing Monopoly is you realize you can't ever really stop if you want to win. You can't coast in Monopoly. You've always got to be on the lookout for how to get more money from the other person, how to continue to build your empire, how to acquire more property. You can't just buy a couple of houses and put them on a couple of your properties and then say, okay, this is good. I'm content here. I'm going to coast. No, in Monopoly, for you to win, the other person has to lose. And so you've constantly got to be getting more and focusing on more. And I probably don't have to draw too many connections with you to remind you of how similar that is to the way our culture calls us to live our lives. That we can't just be content with what we have. We've got to have more. We've got to have newer. We've got to have nicer. That when we watch TV, the commercials that show up or the little ads that pop up when we're on the internet, those are telling us that our lives aren't complete. You need just one more thing. If you really wanted to be content, you really need this. And even now, sometimes we're not content because things aren't the way they used to be. And I'm not going to be content until I can have the same schedule I used to have or do the same things I used to do. But let me ask you a question. 3 months ago, 4 months ago, 5 months ago, were we content then? Was everything going smoothly then? No, chances are we struggled with contentment a year ago, 2 years ago. It's a constant struggle. And Paul gives us some insight here that's very important. Now, the church at Philippi had given Paul a gift to help him through a difficult financial time. So he's thanking them for it, but as he's thanking them, he's reminding them that it was really God that he was trusting in to take care of him. And so you might read through this, and as we start seeing Paul describe their gift, you say, boy, he didn't really thank them the same way I would thank them. Well, Paul wanted to let them know that he's not reliant on money. He's thinking about something else. He's grateful for their generosity, but this is not like a package he was waiting for that he'd ordered from Amazon and couldn't wait to get there. He was trusting in God to see him through. In fact, we see another way that Paul handles this when he writes to the church at Corinth in 1 Corinthians, because the culture in Corinth was replete with people who would hire teachers. You had patron-client relationships where people could hire teachers and those teachers would say what they wanted. And so while he was in Corinth, Paul didn't accept support from the Christians there. Not because he couldn't, but because he thought it was best. He didn't want anyone doubting his motives. And so we see some of that here as Paul's making sure he's above board with the way in which he describes what's happened. But he also tells us something about contentment as he describes that gift. So let's pick up reading in verse 14. Nevertheless, you have done well to share with me in my affliction. You yourselves also know, Philippians, that at the first preaching of the gospel, after I left Macedonia, no church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, but you alone. For even in Thessalonica, you sent a gift more than once for my needs. Not that I seek the gift itself, but I seek for the profit which increases to your account. But I have received everything in full and have an abundance. I am amply supplied, having received from Epaphroditus what you have sent, a fragrant aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, well-pleasing to God. And my God will supply all your needs according to his riches and glory in Christ Jesus. So what do these verses at the end of a letter to the church at Philippi have to teach us about contentment? I think the first insight we can get that should be encouraging for us is that contentment is not easy. It has to be learned. Did you notice that phrase that he used there? He says in verse 11, I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. This is not a natural ability that Paul was just born with. And that tells me it's not a natural ability that some people are born with and some people aren't. It's something I can develop. It's an attitude that I can cultivate. But it's going to take work, and it's going to be different than the world around me. It will be countercultural. A few years ago, in 2017, a man named Devin Sandlin started an unusual experiment. He had a friend who had taken a bike and he had welded it in a certain way that when you turned the handlebars this way, the wheel moved the opposite way. He wanted to see if his friend could ride it. And as you can imagine, if you're used to a bicycle that turns the way you tell it to turn, when it turns the opposite way, it's really going to throw you off. And so you can find videos online of Devin getting on the bicycle and trying to turn it and then falling over, not even being able to stay on there for a few seconds. But he decided he would take a few minutes every day and work on learning how to ride that bike. And it took him 8 months, but he was finally able to ride the bike backwards. Now, interestingly, his younger son tried it on one they had made that at his son's level, and his son took just a few months to figure it out. Younger people can learn these kinds of things, I guess, more quickly than adults. But it took him 8 months to learn how to ride it backwards. And then what was interesting is after he had done that for 8 months, he tried to ride a regular bike. And it's almost as if he'd forgotten how. And he uses that in several presentations and even a TED Talk to describe the way that we learn. But he also took it on the road. And he would go speak before large groups, and he would have volunteers come up on the stage, and he would give them a backwards bicycle. And even when they knew what the deal was, they could know intellectually how to turn it this way and to go that way. There was something else, that other connection that needed to be made before they could balance. And so he would offer sums of money if they could ride it just a few feet across the stage and people couldn't do it. It's a reminder to us of how important it is when we learn something that it goes beyond just our mental understanding and actually exists in practice. And so Paul is telling us that contentment is possible. And it's not just a matter of what's up here. And that is important. Because notice those first verses that we read when he described the peace of God. Remember, in a congregation that is experiencing some dissension, he says what you need to do is focus on what's true, honorable, right, pure, lovely, good repute. If there's excellence, anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things. It starts up here. It starts by changing the way we think, but learning is going to also mean that it exists in the way that we live. We've all had to learn some new things over the last few months. We've had to learn what it's like to make do indoors. Maybe you've had to learn how to work from home if that's not something you've done before. We've had to learn we're not in control. We wish that we were, but there are things outside of our control. We've had to learn how to bear with people who think differently than we do. And maybe our culture is not doing as well at that as we should. But we've had to learn a lot of things. It's a learning process. So contentment is not natural. It's something that has to be learned. It's not natural, and it's also not circumstantial. Paul's clear that circumstances do not dictate his contentment. After all, Paul wrote this letter while he was imprisoned. That didn't limit his joy. And that tells me that my joy isn't limited based on my circumstances. We often think, though, that a change in circumstance in life is what's really going to bring us joy, don't we? Typically, we say, if I want to be happy, I want to think of the right circumstances. If I want my children to be happy, I want to make sure they have the right circumstances. And we focus so much on that, we forget the reason for joy to begin with. Think about the way the Proverbs writer puts it in Proverbs 30, starting in verse 8. Keep deception and lies far from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is my portion, that I not be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or that I not be in want and steal and profane the name of my God. Isn't that an interesting passage? He's saying, give me enough so I'm not in need, but don't give me too much, because there's a danger there as well. We often don't think of that. We don't think about circumstances that would be dangerously good or dangerously enjoyable, but the Proverbs writer did. Have you ever known someone who was unhappy in a specific circumstance, and they were convinced it was that circumstance, it was that place, it was that job that was doing it to me, it's that relationship, it's that congregation, that if I could just change this circumstance, then I'd be fine? There are a lot of people who can move from one unhappy circumstance and go to a new setting and realize the problem was not in the circumstance. I might change my surroundings, but if the problem's internal, if it's with me, I'm not going to find contentment just by a change of location. In the novel Nathan Coulter, Wendell Berry, the author, tells a story of this family that's grown up in the farmland of Kentucky. And Nathan, the main character of this novel, remembers advice from his Uncle Burley that he got while they walked through farmland. He says, Uncle Burley said hills always looked blue when you were far away from them. That was a pretty color for hills. The little houses and barns and fields looked so neat and quiet tucked against them. It made you want to be close to them. He said that when you got close, they were like the hills you'd left. And when you looked back, your own hills were blue and you wanted to go back again. He said he reckoned a man could wear himself out going back and forth. Doesn't that sound like the human condition? This looks good, I want these circumstances. And then you get there, and now there's another set of circumstances that's caught your eye. It's never going to be enough. So contentment isn't circumstantial. If contentment was circumstantial, all I would need would be the right environment. And if contentment was circumstantial, then no one in a wrong environment could have joy. But Paul's writing from prison. He's pretty joyful. So it's not based on where we are. In addition to that, we don't often fully understand our circumstances. Have you ever thought about that? There is an element of our current situation we understand, but there are probably other things happening that we don't understand. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes. In fact, in the book of Philippians, Paul mentions Christians who were in Caesar's household. Now, we don't know all the details of exactly how that would work. I believe that as Paul is writing this, he's imprisoned in Rome. Others have looked at it and believe he might have been writing this from Ephesus. But either way, you have servants of Caesar's household that evidently had been converted by Paul's preaching. There were Christians that the church at Philippi may not have even known about, that were members, that were servants of the household of Caesar, and that had a close proximity with the one in charge with incredible authority. There may be Christians in places we don't realize. Maybe we're reminded of 1 Kings 19, when the prophet Elijah is convinced that he and he alone is the only one who's left. He's the only one who's faithful to God. He's faced off with all these prophets on Mount Carmel, and now the queen Jezebel is seeking to put him to death, and he's complaining before God, I'm the only one who's left, and God tells them there are still 7,000 who haven't bowed their knee to Baal, the false god. In other words, you think you're the only one, but you don't know the whole story. We don't know the whole story of our own circumstances. So contentment is not easy. It's not going to just come naturally to us. We're going to have to learn it. It's not circumstantial. It's not based on where we are at any given time. But it's also not impossible. In the ancient world, there were Stoic philosophers who talked about being content with one's lot in life, that it was a personal virtue. And so when Paul talks about contentment, some people might think he's just adopting that Stoic language. He's just using that word to describe this same kind of concept, but there's a key difference here. The Stoic philosophers said you were content based on your own personal virtue. You developed contentment. It was like a muscle that you could exercise and that you could grow stronger. And when you were content, it was showing how much you had progressed and how much virtue you possessed. Paul says contentment comes from God, not through our own personal virtue. And that's when we get to this famous verse, Philippians 4, verse 13. As we think about whether you've seen it on a sign at athletic events, whether you've seen it maybe as a bumper sticker or on a coffee mug, think about this statement: I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Often we lift that verse and we use that verse as sort of an encouragement for us, and I think that's good, but we need to be careful when we lift this verse out, we don't forget about the context. Think about the context of this verse. The context is in discussing contentment. When we look at the language there, even I can do all things might be more accurately rendered, I can endure all things. So Paul's not talking about developing a superpower where I can do whatever I want. In other words, he's saying I can endure what comes my way. I can be content in what comes my way through God who strengthens me. And by the way, I believe this tells us that Paul understood contentment to be hard. If he didn't think contentment was difficult, then would we read Philippians 4:13, I can endure all things? Apparently it was pretty challenging. It's challenging, but it was not impossible. The reason it's not impossible is not because we can develop our own personal virtue, but because we have resources that no one else can rely on other than God's children. Resources that are greater than any kind of self-help book or program or something we might subscribe to, a podcast we might listen to. There are spiritual resources that can give us contentment. It's there for us, but we have to come to him and to access it. And as Paul described already in the letter to the church at Philippi, it was going to take some serious effort. It was going to take the kind of humility that Jesus had when he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on the cross. That's the level Paul's throwing out there for us. That's what he's saying we're called to do if we want to live a life that's content. Contentment is not easy, and it's not circumstantial. But the good news of Philippians is it is not impossible. Now, before we leave this topic, I think there's something important we need to think about. And that is the difference between contentment and complacency. It's one thing to be content, to be thankful for my lot in life, to look around at the blessings God has given me, and to say a prayer of thanksgiving. It's another thing to be complacent and to just think, I've been a Christian long enough. I've been in the church long enough. I've done enough. I don't really have to be that active. I don't really have to get involved. And I'm convinced that one of the downsides of everything that's happened is that temptation to be complacent has grown. Because now, for many of us, we've gotten out of the habits that had been ingrained of when we went to worship on Sunday and Sunday night and Wednesday night. And now we have these avenues to worship virtually and to access things online, and that's great. But now we can choose to do it or not to do it, and no one necessarily has to know. And there won't be anyone necessarily calling us to check on why we haven't watched the sermon from last Sunday or why we didn't watch the Winning Wednesdays class. And maybe it could be easy to be complacent. Complacent is not contentment. They're not the same thing. When I'm content, I'm thankful for what God has given me. In the situation where I am, I'm joyfully serving Him. When I'm complacent, I'm just coasting. I've done enough. I've worked hard enough. I don't really need to do that much more. But that's not the kind of life Paul's described in Philippians. That's not the kind of life that's set out for us in the New Testament. The radical love of Christ causes us, motivates us to work, to change that status quo and not just settle for what's going on around us. So the good news in the middle of all this chaotic, challenging time around us where things are different, they're not like they used to be. And we don't need to pretend like they're like they used to be. The good news is even when our situation changes, God remains the same and contentment is possible. It's not sliding into complacency, but it's serving Christ and serving in the way that Christ served us, humbling ourselves and working to spread His word and the borders of His kingdom. I appreciate you letting me spend some time reflecting on this text with you. I hope it's a blessing for you as you go throughout the rest of the week. Let's look for ways over these next few days that we can find the kind of contentment Paul talks about here, and that we can live for Him.
Hey, this is Scott Patterson, and I want to thank you so much for joining us for our Winning Wednesdays lesson. And I hope you were encouraged and uplifted by that lesson. But you may be sitting here thinking, I think I need to respond to what was said tonight. And if you need to respond, here's how you can reach out. You can call me at 803-257-3880. You can reach out to our involvement minister, Jeremy Hynode, at 706-830-3229. Or you can reach out to our youth minister, Sam, at 423-779-6586. You can also email us generally at secretary@visitcentral.org, or you can email me personally at minister@visitcentral.org. Again, thank you so much for joining us for this Winning Wednesdays lesson. And if you need to respond, please do, and we'll reach out to you straight away. Thank you.